the sweltering summer of 1867, a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitmore made his way to the remote East Texas town of Millfield to lead a revival meeting. What he uncovered behind the walls of the old courthouse would forever change his life. Over the course of 18 months, 89 men had disappeared without a trace, all last seen entering Judge Harrison Crawford's courtroom for sentencing. Official records claimed they were transferred to the state penitentiary, yet no prison in Texas had any record of their arrival. When Reverend Whitmore finally uncovered the sinister truth about Crawford's basement chambers, he discovered evidence of unimaginable horrors, systematic torture, starvation, and murder. The details were so chilling that even the most hardened soul would struggle to maintain faith in humanity. For over a century, the Methodist Church buried his report. But recently uncovered church archives reveal the horrifying reality, including Crawford's own handwritten journals describing his divine mission to purify souls through suffering. But before we continue with the chilling tale of Judge Crawford and the disappearance of those 89 souls, let me ask you, if you're someone who seeks the truth behind America's darkest secrets, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now and drop a comment letting me know which state you're listening from. I read every single comment and love connecting with fellow mystery seekers who aren't afraid to confront the shadows of our past. The events that unfolded in Millfield would shatter everything the townsfolk believed about justice, faith, and the men they trusted to protect them. But to understand the full horror of what Crawford had done, we must first examine the community that allowed him to operate openly for nearly 2 years. Millfield, Texas, was a town that time seemed to forget even as it was being built, tucked away in the dense pine forests of East Texas, about 40 miles southeast of Marshall. The town emerged during the chaos of Reconstruction as a place where Confederate veterans could start anew, far from the watchful eyes of federal authorities. The town's population never surpassed 400, and its isolation made it an ideal refuge for those looking to escape their past, or as it turned out, for predators seeking to avoid scrutiny. Please give me a like and subscribe so I can be motivated to create more great videos. Millfield was founded in 1864 by Colonel James Millfield, a former Confederate cavalry officer who had bought several thousand acres of timberland, claiming to have saved the money before the war. Whispers among the townspeople, though never spoken aloud, suggested that Millfield had likely looted the funds from a Union supply train during one of his final raids into Louisiana. But in the lawless atmosphere of post-war Texas, such questions were considered impolite and even dangerous. The town itself was laid out in a simple grid pattern, with Main Street running east to west and 3 cross streets dividing the settlement into neat blocks. The business district consisted of a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small hotel called the Pinaravev Inn, and Miller's Saloon, where the men gathered each evening to drink corn whiskey and tell stories of the war. Most of the residents lived in modest wooden homes with front porches and vegetable gardens. Simple dwellings that reflected their honest ambitions and limited means. At the heart of Millfield stood the courthouse, a fortress of red brick and limestone. Its Gothic revival architecture stood in stark contrast to the modest wooden buildings surrounding it. Judge Harrison Crawford had commissioned its construction in 1865, sparing no expense despite the town's limited resources. The building soared 3 stories above the dusty streets, its pointed arches and decorative stonework, giving it the appearance of a medieval cathedral rather than a seat of frontier justice. The courthouse's most striking feature was its unusually deep basement, which Crawford claimed was necessary for storing legal documents and evidence in the humid East Texas climate. The basement windows, barely visible above ground, were secured with heavy iron bars, which Crawford explained were needed to protect valuable court records from theft. The townsfolk never questioned this explanation, for Crawford was not only their judge, but also their most influential citizen. He had donated the land for the Methodist Church and funded the construction of their schoolhouse. Judge Harrison Crawford himself is an imposing figure, commanding respect through both his physical presence and legal authority, standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a military bearing. He moved through Millfield with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. His steel-gray hair was always meticulously groomed, and his black judicial robes were immaculate despite the dusty frontier conditions. His piercing blue eyes seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated accent of Virginia's gentleman class, a reminder of his refined origins in a world far removed from the rough frontier settlement he now called home. Crawford had arrived in Millfield shortly after construction of the courthouse began, bringing with him impeccable credentials from the University of Virginia Law School and letters of recommendation from prominent attorneys in Richmond. His legal expertise was undeniable. He could quote vast passages of Virginia's legal code from memory, cite precedents dating back to English common law, and construct arguments that would have impressed the most learned jurists in the state. The townsfolk considered themselves incredibly fortunate to have such a distinguished legal mind among them, especially given their remote location and limited resources. But there was something unsettling about Judge Crawford, that the people of Millfield couldn't quite articulate a quality that made conversations with him feel more like interrogations, even when discussing something as innocent as the weather. He never married despite several attempts by local families to introduce him to eligible young women from neighboring towns. When asked about his bachelor status, he would smile tightly and explain that his devotion to the law left little room for domestic considerations. "Justice is a jealous mistress," he would say, "and she demands complete devotion from those who would serve her properly." Crawford kept no servants, maintaining his large 2-story house entirely by himself, despite having the means to hire help. The house itself was as impressive as the courthouse, a Greek revival mansion with white columns and wraparound porches more fitting for a Virginia plantation than a small East Texas lumber town. Those few who visited the house noted its pristine condition and the extensive library that filled 2 entire rooms. The books ranged from legal texts to theological works, with a particular focus on divine justice, moral philosophy, and Crawford's own interpretation of the purification of the human soul. The most peculiar detail of all was Crawford's insistence on personally overseeing all prisoner transfers to the state penitentiary, refusing the help of local law enforcement or federal marshals. This was highly unusual, as most frontier judges were eager to delegate such mundane tasks to others. But Crawford treated each transfer as a sacred duty, claiming the condemned men deserved his personal attention during their final moments in the community. "The law is a sacred trust," he would explain to anyone who questioned his methods, "and I will not delegate my responsibilities to others who might lack the proper understanding of divine justice. These men have been placed in my care by God and the people of Texas, and I will see that they receive the treatment their souls require." The Methodist congregation, led by a circuit preacher who visited monthly, had grown accustomed to Crawford's irregular attendance at services. He would appear on Easter and Christmas, sitting alone in the front pew with a somber expression as if in deep contemplation. During these services, he sang hymns in a rich baritone voice and followed along with scripture readings in his personal Bible, a massive leather-bound volume he carried everywhere. But he never participated in the social gatherings afterward, politely declining invitations to Sunday dinners and church socials. Some whispered that he was haunted by memories of the war, pointing to the fact that he never spoke of his Confederate service, despite his obvious military bearing. Others suggested he simply preferred solitude, finding more satisfaction in books than in human fellowship. The more charitable explanation was that his dedication to justice required a kind of monastic discipline, leaving little room for ordinary pleasures. Millfield's other prominent feature was the combination jail and courthouse basement, where Crawford held prisoners awaiting trial or sentencing. The jail, visible to the public, was a modest holding area with 4 cells, enough to accommodate a dozen men. The cells were equipped with basic amenities, wooden bunks, chamber pots, and barred windows that provided light and ventilation. Prisoners were fed regularly and allowed visitors in accordance with standard practices in Texas. But the basement extended far beyond, what visitors could see stretching deep into the earth beneath the courthouse, in a network of chambers Crawford had designed and supervised personally. The basement was always locked with heavy-duty padlocks and reinforced iron bars. Crawford claimed it housed sensitive legal documents and evidence which needed protection from the elements and thieves. Martha Kellerman, the courthouse cleaning woman, was one of the few granted access to portions of the basement during daylight hours. A widow in her 50s, Martha had taken the job to support herself after losing her husband in the war. Known for her discretion and work ethic, Crawford trusted her with access to the upper levels of the basement, where she cleaned document storage areas and evidence rooms under his supervision. Even these limited glimpses of the basement raised troubling questions Martha was too afraid to voice. The chambers she cleaned were far more elaborate than necessary for simple storage. The stone walls were carefully mortared, and the floors were surprisingly level and well constructed. The air in these rooms carried a strange mixture of mustiness and something sharper, more unpleasant, that she couldn't identify. Crawford explained that the extensive construction was necessary due to the unstable soil conditions in East Texas, which required deep foundations to prevent collapse. He even pointed to similar techniques used in Virginia's wine cellars, demonstrating his knowledge of architecture and engineering. Though Martha was impressed, her curiosity remained unsatisfied. The pattern that would eventually claim 89 lives began in the bitter winter of 1866. At first, no one noticed the gradual changes, but they were so carefully orchestrated that they seemed like nothing more than the natural evolution of frontier justice finding its rhythm. Men would be sentenced in Crawford's courtroom for various crimes: horse theft, assault robbery, desertion from the Confederate Army, disturbing the peace, and then simply vanish into what everyone assumed was the efficient machinery of Texas justice. That winter was harsh, with ice storms knocking down telegraph lines and making travel between communities nearly impossible for weeks. The isolation that had always characterized Millfield became even more pronounced, creating the perfect conditions for Crawford's actions to go unnoticed just by the outside world. Federal authorities, already overwhelmed by the challenges of Reconstruction, had little time or resources to monitor activities in such a remote town. The first documented victim was Thomas Burke, an Irish immigrant accused of stealing chickens from a neighbor's farm. Burke had arrived in Millfield only months earlier, hoping to earn enough money to bring his wife and children over from County Cork. He had no family in Texas, no powerful friends, and no legal representation beyond Crawford's appointed counsel. The trial was conducted with Crawford's usual attention to procedure. Witnesses were called, testimony was heard, and Burke was given the chance to speak in his own defense. But the proceedings felt theatrical, as if Crawford were performing rituals of justice rather than truly pursuing it. The outcome seemed inevitable, and Burke was sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary for what should have been a minor offense. Thomas Burke, Crawford intoned from the bench, his voice carrying the weight of divine judgment. You have been found guilty of theft in violation of the laws of Texas and the commandments of Almighty God. You will be remanded to my custody for immediate transfer to the state penitentiary, where you will serve 2 years at hard labor. May this punishment serve to purify your soul and prepare you for a more righteous life upon your release. Burke was led away in shackles, and that was the last anyone in Millfield ever saw of him. Crawford explained that Burke's transfer had been arranged during the night, as he preferred to conduct such matters away from the public eye. There's no need to make a spectacle of these proceedings, he told a few townspeople who inquired. The man has a right to maintain some dignity, even in his disgrace. It was Martha Kellerman who first noticed something was amiss with these transfers. As the courthouse cleaning woman, she arrived early each morning to sweep the floors, dust the furniture, and prepare the building for another day of legal proceedings. Martha had expected to find evidence of Burke's departure, perhaps muddy footprints from the transfer wagon or some paperwork left on Crawford's desk. But when she looked, she found nothing at all to suggest that anyone had entered or left the building during the night. When she mentioned this to Crawford, he explained that he had become quite efficient at conducting transfers without disturbing the courthouse's normal operations. "I take pride in leaving no trace of these unpleasant necessities," he said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The people of Millfield shouldn't have to be reminded of the criminal elements in our midst every time they enter this building. As the winter wore on, and the list of sentenced prisoners grew, Martha began to notice more troubling things that made it harder for her to sleep at night. Crawford was working later and later into the night with his office windows glowing with lamplight well past midnight. She could see the light from her small cabin behind the courthouse and often found herself awake wondering what legal business could possibly require such dedication in the hours before dawn. Even more unsettling were the sounds that occasionally drifted through the courthouse's thick walls during Crawford's midnight sessions. Martha had cleaned buildings all her life, and she knew the difference between the normal settling of timber and stone and the sounds of human activity. What she heard from the basement during those late-night sessions sounded like voices, muffled conversations, occasional shouts, and at times what sounded disturbingly like sobbing or moaning. When she finally mustered the courage to ask Crawford about the sounds, his explanation was both plausible and unsatisfying. "The acoustics in that basement are quite peculiar," he said with his usual patient smile. "Sound carries in unexpected ways through those stone chambers. What you're hearing is probably just the settling of the building, or perhaps rats in the walls. Old buildings make all sorts of mysterious noises, especially when the temperature changes and the materials are stressed." But Martha, having grown up in a farmhouse over 50 years old, knew every sound an aging building could make. What she heard from the courthouse basement was not the creaking of timber or the scurrying of rodents. It was human voices speaking in tones of desperation and fear that sent shivers down her spine. Martha started to pay closer attention to the comings and goings at the courthouse, noting details that she had previously overlooked. Prisoners would enter Crawford's courtroom for sentencing, but they never seemed to leave through the front door. When she asked Crawford about this, he explained that he preferred to conduct transfers through the basement entrance to avoid creating a spectacle for the townspeople. "These men have families, Martha, even if those families have disowned them for their crimes," he said. "There's no need to parade them through the streets like circus animals. I arrange for their transport through the basement entrance where they can maintain some dignity in their final moments in our community." The explanation seemed reasonable at first, but Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had never seen a prison transport wagon anywhere near the courthouse, despite Crawford's claims that transfers were happening regularly. The road behind the courthouse, where such a wagon would logically wait, showed no signs of heavy traffic or the distinctive wheel ruts that would be left by a loaded transport. Martha also began noticing other details that seemed inconsistent with Crawford's explanations. The judge was ordering an unusual amount of supplies for the courthouse, far more than necessary for the few prisoners typically held overnight before transfer. His monthly orders from the general store included vast quantities of food, hardtack salt pork beans, and cornmeal in amounts that could feed dozens of men for extended periods. When the store owner mentioned this to Martha, Crawford explained that he was stockpiling supplies in case of severe weather that might delay transfers. Even more disturbing were the medical supplies Crawford ordered with increasing frequency: bandages, laudanum, surgical instruments, and other items that seemed excessive for treating the minor injuries that might occur during normal courthouse operations. When Martha questioned him about this, he explained that he had taken on the responsibility of providing medical care for prisoners in poor condition. "Many of these men have been living rough before their arrest," he said. "They arrive here suffering from malnutrition, untreated injuries, and various ailments that require attention before they can be safely transferred to the state penitentiary. I consider it my Christian duty to ensure they receive proper medical care during their time in my custody." But it was the smells that occasionally wafted up from the basement that convinced Martha something was seriously wrong. Having grown up on a farm, she was familiar with the ordinary odors of life and death. The smell of slaughtered livestock, rotting vegetables, and human waste. But what occasionally came from the courthouse basement was something else, something far more disturbing. There was the metallic scent of blood, but not the fresh blood of a recent injury. This was the thick, cloying smell of blood that had been spilled in large quantities and allowed to congeal. There was also a sickly sweet odor of decay that reminded her of a cow that had died in a remote pasture and hadn't been discovered for several days. Most disturbing of all was a sharp chemical smell that burned her nostrils and made her eyes water, the unmistakable scent of lime and lye substances used for breaking down organic matter. When Martha finally confronted Crawford about these smells, his reaction was the first time she had ever seen him display anything resembling anger. His usual calm demeanor cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "Mrs. Kellerman," he said sharply, his voice taking on an edge that made her step back instinctively. "I would strongly advise you to focus on your cleaning duties and leave the administration of justice to those qualified to handle such matters." He went on to explain. "The basement contains evidence from various criminal cases, including some rather unpleasant incidents involving livestock theft and property damage. What you're detecting is likely the odor of preserved animal remains and chemical preservatives used in evidence storage." His explanation was delivered with his usual authority. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he was no longer entirely convinced of his own ability to maintain the deception. Martha nodded and retreated to her duties, but she had seen enough to know that whatever was happening in the courthouse basement had nothing to do with evidence storage or normal legal procedures. That night, Martha began keeping a careful record of everything she observed at the courthouse. She noted the names of prisoners brought before Crawford for sentencing, the dates of their trials, and the official explanations for their subsequent disappearances. She recorded the unusual orders Crawford placed with local merchants, the strange sounds and smells coming from the basement, and the judge's increasingly erratic behavior during their brief conversations. By the spring of 1867, Martha's careful documentation revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. 37 men had been sentenced in Crawford's courtroom, and all of them had vanished without a trace. None of them had been seen boarding prison transport wagons. None of their families had heard from them after their supposed transfers, and none of the state prison facilities had any record of their arrival. As the long winter of 1866 gave way to a wet and muddy spring, the missing prisoners began to haunt the collective memory of Millfield in ways no one had anticipated. The disappearances had been gradual enough that no single incident had raised immediate alarm. But the cumulative effect was beginning to create an atmosphere of unease that permeated every aspect of life in the small town. Wives and mothers began arriving at the courthouse, more frequently seeking information about their husbands and sons who had vanished into Crawford's custody. These women, some traveling for days through dangerous territory, came with letters from state prison authorities confirming that no prisoner by their loved one's name had been received despite Crawford's official documentation. Sarah Morrison, the wife of Samuel Morrison, a church deacon convicted of grain theft, was perhaps the most persistent of these women. A devout Methodist, Sarah refused to accept Crawford's explanations for her husband's disappearance. Determined and resourceful, Sarah had managed the family farm alone during her husband's service in the Confederate Army. She was not about to let Crawford's lies stand unchallenged. Sarah's questions were sharp and well-researched, and her refusal to be intimidated by Crawford's judicial authority made her the natural leader for the other concerned families. "Judge Crawford," she said during one of her weekly visits to the courthouse, "I've traveled to Huntsville myself and spoken with the warden at the state penitentiary. They have no record of receiving my husband despite your written documentation claiming he was transferred 3 months ago. I've also contacted the federal authorities responsible for prisoner transport, and they have no record of any transfers from this courthouse. Where is my husband?" Crawford's response to such challenges was always the same patient, logical explanations about bureaucratic inefficiency, lost paperwork, and the chaos still gripping Texas government in the wake of war and Reconstruction. He spoke with the authority of a man who understood the complexities of the legal system better than anyone else, and his explanations were delivered with such confidence that many found them convincing, despite their obvious inconsistencies. "Mrs. Morrison," Crawford would say, "I understand your distress, and I sympathize with your situation. But you must understand that the state government is still recovering from the disruptions of the war. Records are being lost. Prisoners are being transferred between facilities without proper documentation, and communication between institutions is unreliable at best. Your husband was lawfully convicted and sentenced, and he was transferred according to proper procedures. The fact that prison officials can't immediately locate his records doesn't mean he's vanished. It simply means the bureaucracy is overwhelmed and disorganized." But Sarah Morrison was not the type to accept convenient explanations when they contradicted the facts before her. She began conducting her own investigation, traveling throughout East Texas to speak with families of other missing prisoners and gather evidence that challenged Crawford's official narrative. What she discovered was a troubling pattern of disappearances that extended far beyond her own husband's case. Thomas Burke, the Irish immigrant who had been the first to vanish, had promised to write to his wife in County Cork as soon as he was settled in prison. Those letters never came, and Burke's wife had begun writing to Texas authorities, seeking answers about her husband's fate. Her letters had been forwarded to Crawford, who responded with vague assurances that Burke was serving his sentence and that communication would be restored once administrative problems were resolved. Jacob Mueller, a German farmer convicted of assault after a dispute with a neighbor, had also failed to contact his family after his supposed transfer to the state penitentiary. Mueller was known for writing to his relatives in Germany every month without fail, and his sudden silence was completely out of character and deeply troubling to those who knew him. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the case of Benjamin Hawkins, a young man from a prominent East Texas family who had been convicted of horse theft. Hawkins' father, a successful merchant with connections throughout the region, had hired attorneys to trace his son's fate after the supposed transfer to the state prison. The investigation revealed that no prisoner transport had left Millfield on the date Crawford's documentation claimed, and no transport had arrived at any Texas prison facility during the relevant time period. As Sarah compiled the stories of these and many other missing men, a chilling picture began to form. Crawford was documenting prisoner transfers that had never happened, claiming to follow legal procedures that left no real evidence of their implementation. The missing men came from all walks of life in East Texas, from poor immigrants like Thomas Burke to the sons of wealthy families like Benjamin Hawkins. The only thing they had in common was that they had all disappeared after being sentenced in Crawford's courtroom. Sarah also discovered troubling details about Crawford's personal behavior that had previously been dismissed as eccentricities. Several townspeople reported seeing lights in the courthouse basement at all hours of the night, often accompanied by sounds, suggesting intensive activity of some kind. The local blacksmith mentioned that Crawford had ordered an unusual number of metal implements, chains, locks, bars, and other hardware that seemed excessive for normal courthouse security. Most notably, Sarah discovered that Crawford had been purchasing enormous quantities of lime and lye from merchants throughout the region, always paying in cash and refusing to explain their intended use. Lime and lye were common enough substances on the frontier used for everything from construction to soap making. But the quantities Crawford was ordering suggested industrial-scale applications that made no sense for a courthouse operation. When Sarah confronted Crawford with this evidence, his response revealed the first cracks in the calm facade he had maintained for so long. His usual patient explanations became shorter and more defensive, and his eyes hardened in a way she had never seen before. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his voice growing colder, "I'm beginning to find your persistent questioning both inappropriate and disrespectful. I am a duly appointed judge carrying out my responsibilities according to Texas law. If you have concerns about legal procedures, you're welcome to file a complaint with the state authorities. But I will not tolerate continued harassment in my own courthouse." The threat was clear and precise, and for the first time Sarah realized that Crawford was not simply an incompetent bureaucrat. He might be something far more dangerous. She began to share her findings with other families and concerned townspeople, forming a network of individuals who were all asking the same troubling questions about the fate of their loved ones. Martha Kellerman became a crucial ally in their investigation, sharing her observations about Crawford's strange behavior and the disturbing sounds and smells coming from the courthouse basement. Martha's testimony was especially valuable due to her position as a courthouse employee and her reputation for honesty and discretion. "Something terrible is happening in that basement," Martha told the group of concerned families. "I hear voices down there at night, voices of men who sound like they're in pain or terror. Judge Crawford claims it's just the building settling or rats in the walls. But I know the difference between building sounds and human voices. Those are men crying out for help, and nobody's listening." The group began to meet secretly at the Methodist Church, drawing strength and comfort from their shared faith as they continued their search for the truth. They prayed for guidance and found strength in their conviction that God would not allow such evil to go unpunished indefinitely. Sarah Morrison emerged as their unofficial leader, organizing their efforts and maintaining detailed records of their findings. But their investigation was hampered by Crawford's position of authority and the reluctance of law enforcement to challenge a sitting judge. The local sheriff was a political appointee who owed his position to Crawford's influence, and federal authorities were hesitant to intervene, dismissing the growing concerns as unsubstantiated rumors. After all, the missing men had all been convicted criminals, and their disappearances could easily be explained away by administrative incompetence rather than criminal activity. As summer approached, the tension in Millfield grew ever more palpable. Crawford's behavior became increasingly erratic and defensive, while the families of the missing prisoners grew louder in their demands for answers. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal the true extent of the horrors hidden beneath the courthouse floors. The breakthrough that would eventually expose Crawford's crimes came from the most unexpected source, a young man widely regarded as simple-minded, but whose survival instincts would prove sharper than those of far more educated men. Billy Tate, barely 19 years old, illiterate, and dismissed by most of Millfield's residents as a harmless vagrant, had an intimate knowledge of the East Texas wilderness. His natural cunning would ultimately make him the key to unraveling Crawford's carefully constructed deception. Billy had been arrested in late May 1867 for stealing a horse from a farmer outside of town. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had been caught riding the stolen animal with no plausible explanation for how he had come to possess it. But Billy's case differed from those of the previous victims. In one crucial respect, unlike the others, Billy had grown up in the forests around Millfield and had an almost supernatural ability to navigate in darkness and survive in hostile conditions. The trial itself followed Crawford's now familiar pattern. Billy was appointed a defense attorney who made only perfunctory efforts on his behalf. Witnesses testified to his obvious guilt, and Crawford delivered a sentence that seemed disproportionately harsh for the crime committed. Billy was sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary, even though horse theft typically warranted much shorter terms. "William Tate," Crawford intoned from the bench, his voice carrying the usual tone of divine judgment. "You have been found guilty of horse theft, a crime that strikes at the very foundation of civilized society. Your actions demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for the property rights of honest citizens and the moral order that binds our community together. You will be remanded to my custody for immediate transfer to the state penitentiary, where you will serve 3 years at hard labor. May this punishment serve to correct your wayward nature and restore you to the path of righteousness." But unlike the previous victims, Billy Tate was not led quietly away to accept his fate. His experience living rough in the East Texas wilderness had taught him to trust his instincts about danger, and everything about Crawford's courthouse triggered his deepest survival instincts. When the bailiff approached to escort him to the holding cells, Billy's entire body tensed with the alertness of a wild animal, sensing a predator. Billy was initially held in the regular jail cells, visible to the public, sharing space with two other men awaiting trial for minor offenses. During his 3 days in these cells, he had the opportunity to observe Crawford's routine and study the layout of the courthouse building. What he noticed immediately was that Crawford spent an extraordinary amount of time in the basement areas, which were supposedly used only for storage, often working late into the night, with sounds of activity that seemed inconsistent with document filing or evidence cataloging. More significantly, Billy noticed that Crawford seemed to be preparing for something special. The judge ordered additional supplies from the general store, including rope metal restraints and medical equipment that seemed excessive for a simple prisoner transfer. Crawford also spent considerable time studying Billy, specifically watching him with an intensity that went far beyond normal judicial interest in a convicted criminal. On the evening before his scheduled transfer, Billy was moved from the public jail cells to a holding area in the basement that Crawford claimed was more secure. This was the first time Billy had been taken below ground level, and what he found there immediately confirmed his worst fears about Crawford's true intentions. The basement was far more extensive than anyone above ground had realized. Crawford had constructed a complex network of chambers and corridors that extended deep into the earth beneath the courthouse, creating what amounted to a secret prison that could hold dozens of men without any possibility of detection from the outside world. The walls were lined with carefully fitted stone blocks. The floors were paved with brick, and the ceilings were supported by heavy wooden beams, indicating careful engineering and substantial investment. But it was the evidence of long-term occupation that truly terrified Billy. The holding cell where he was placed showed clear signs of having housed multiple prisoners for extended periods. The straw covering the floor had been changed recently, but underneath Billy could see stains that suggested previous occupants had suffered injuries or worse. The walls bore scratches and markings that looked like attempts to track time or leave messages for future prisoners. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that echoed through the basement during the night hours. Billy could hear voices coming from deeper chambers, voices of men who were clearly in distress, crying out in pain or pleading for mercy. These were not the sounds of men awaiting comfortable transport to state prison. They were the sounds of men who had been subjected to systematic abuse and who had given up hope of rescue. Billy's survival instincts, honed by years of living on the margins of civilized society, told him that he was in mortal danger and that escape was his only chance of survival. Unlike the previous victims, however, Billy possessed skills that made escape a realistic possibility. He had grown up breaking into abandoned buildings and finding ways through locked doors, and his small size and natural agility gave him advantages that larger men would not have possessed. Over the course of his first night in the basement, Billy carefully examined his cell and the surrounding area, looking for weaknesses in Crawford's security arrangements. What he discovered was that Crawford's attention to the psychological aspects of imprisonment had exceeded his attention to purely physical security measures. The basement chambers were designed to be escape-proof, primarily through intimidation and despair, rather than through impregnable construction. Billy noticed that one of the stones in his cell wall was slightly loose, apparently weakened by water seepage over time. Working carefully through the night, he managed to widen the gap, enough to remove the stone entirely, creating an opening that led to the building's foundation area. From there, he could access a drainage tunnel that Crawford had apparently overlooked during his security preparations. But Billy's escape was complicated by what he observed during his second day in Crawford's custody. He was taken from his cell to what Crawford called an examination, a process that revealed the true scope of the judge's depravity and the fate that had befallen the previous prisoners. Billy Tate's examination took place in a chamber deep beneath the courthouse, a room Crawford had constructed with meticulous attention to detail, as if pursuing his life's work. The room was larger than the holding cells, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of lamplight. The walls were lined with the same carefully fitted stone blocks that characterized the rest of the basement. But these stones were stained and discolored, showing signs of activities far removed from normal judicial proceedings. Crawford had transformed for these sessions, exchanging his judicial robes for a simple black cassock that gave him the appearance of a medieval monk or inquisitor. His demeanor was completely different from the calm, professional manner he displayed in his public courtroom. Here in the depths of his secret chambers, he radiated an intensity that was both terrifying and somehow religious in its fervor. William Tate. Crawford began, his voice echoing off the stone walls with unnatural resonance. You stand before the throne of true justice, where the superficial laws of men give way to the eternal laws of divine righteousness. The proceedings upstairs were necessary theater performed for those who lack the spiritual insight to understand the true nature of justice. But here in these sacred chambers, we will undertake the real work of purifying your soul. The chamber contained devices inspired by medieval Inquisition chambers, but crafted with the precision of someone who understood both engineering and human anatomy. A wooden chair stood equipped with leather straps and metal fixtures that could be adjusted to cause varying degrees of pain and restraint. Nearby, a table covered with surgical instruments, some familiar and others frighteningly unfamiliar, hinted at purposes that had nothing to do with medicine. Most terrifying of all was Crawford's obvious expertise with these devices. He moved among them with the familiarity of a craftsman, preparing his tools for another day's work. It was clear Billy was not the first to be brought to this chamber, and the judge's practiced movements suggested that many others had preceded him. The process of spiritual purification requires complete honesty. Crawford continued, his voice becoming more fervent. You must confess not only the crimes for which you were convicted, but every sin you have ever committed, every impure thought you have entertained, every moment you have strayed from the path of righteousness. Only through complete confession and penance can your soul be prepared for the judgment that awaits us all. Billy had encountered religious fanatics before in his travels, but Crawford's intensity went far beyond ordinary evangelical fervor. The judge seemed to genuinely believe he had been divinely appointed to carry out a mission of spiritual purification that transcended ordinary legal procedures. His eyes held the glassy certainty of a man who had convinced himself that his actions, however horrific, were justified by a higher purpose. Crawford began the interrogation with seemingly innocent questions about Billy's childhood, his family background, and his education. But gradually the questioning became more invasive and disturbing, probing into areas of personal experience unrelated to his crime. You see, William, Crawford explained during a pause in the questioning, the crime for which you were convicted is merely a symptom of a deeper spiritual corruption that has taken root in your soul. Horse theft is an act of pride and rebellion against the natural order God has established. But to truly cleanse your soul, we must identify and address all the sins that led you to this moment of criminality. When Billy refused to confess to sins he had never committed, Crawford began to employ the devices he had so carefully prepared. The process started with minor discomfort, tight restraints that limited circulation, uncomfortable positions that caused muscle cramps. But Crawford was a patient man, and he took clear pleasure in the gradual escalation of pain. Pain is a gift from God, Crawford explained as he adjusted the restraints, his voice carrying an eerie calmness. It serves to focus the mind on spiritual matters and to burn away the pride and stubbornness that prevent us from acknowledging our sins. Every moment of suffering brings you closer to the spiritual honesty your soul requires. Billy's experience living rough in the wilderness had given him a tolerance for discomfort Crawford had never encountered in previous victims. More importantly, Billy's natural cunning allowed him to understand that Crawford's process was designed to break down psychological resistance rather than simply inflict pain. By offering Crawford the confessions he sought, Billy could buy time to plan his escape, while avoiding the more severe tortures Crawford was clearly prepared to employ. As the group of concerned townspeople led by Sarah Morrison made their way to the courthouse that morning, there was a sense of quiet resolve among them. What had started as a whisper of suspicion had now become an undeniable truth, and they were prepared to confront the horrors lurking beneath their very feet. Sarah, with her unyielding determination, knew this was the moment to act not just for the missing men, but for the soul of Millfield itself. Billy, hidden in the woods just outside of town, could only watch as the group gathered. He was exhausted from his ordeal, but the urgency of his mission had given him strength he never knew he had. His testimony, filled with vivid details of Crawford's sadistic methods and the men still trapped in those chambers, had already begun to shake the foundations of the town's trust in their beloved judge. Inside the courthouse, Crawford remained oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon him. He had grown complacent, perhaps even delusional, in his self-righteous belief that he was carrying out God's work. The late-night drinking sessions and rambling monologues were just the final cracks in the carefully constructed facade he had spent so long building. As Sarah and the delegation entered the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The group moved through the hallways with purpose, determined to confront Crawford, who was no doubt in his office preparing for another of his spiritual examinations. They knew that what they were about to uncover would shake the entire town to its core. Sarah knocked on Crawford's office door, her voice steady and firm as she called out, "Judge Crawford, we need to speak with you. We've come to demand access to the basement." The truth can no longer be ignored. Crawford's voice from within was low and steady, laced with a trace of annoyance. "I told you all there is to know, Mrs. Morrison. What you seek is nothing but rumors and lies." But Sarah's resolve did not waver. "No, Judge. We know the truth now. Your house of cards is about to fall." As the group entered the judge's office, the atmosphere shifted. Crawford, his expression betraying a flicker of panic, rose from his chair. "You have no right to accuse me," he spat, his voice barely a whisper. "I am the law here. I have done what I must to purify souls." But his calm veneer was cracking, and the townspeople, once so loyal, could sense it. They had come together, and now they would stand united against the monster who had manipulated them for so long. "Your spiritual purification is a mask for murder," Crawford Sarah declared. "We've heard enough to know that your so-called justice has cost dozens of lives." With that, the group began to move towards the basement, pushing past the increasingly erratic Crawford. The judge made a desperate attempt to stop them, but his power had already slipped through his fingers. His eyes, once confident and calculating, now held a look of pure panic. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll ruin everything," he shouted. The townspeople paid no mind. They had already seen enough to know the true horror that lurked below. They reached the basement door, but Crawford lunged at them, desperate to maintain control. It was only when Sarah held up Billy's testimony, his detailed descriptions of the basement's layout, the torture devices, and the names of the men still alive, that the door finally swung open. What they discovered inside confirmed every nightmare Billy had spoken of. The basement was far more than a storage area. It was a chamber of horrors. The walls were lined with cruel devices, some of which appeared to have been used to hold prisoners in excruciating positions for days, even weeks. The stench of decay and chemicals filled the air, and in the back of the room, the townspeople saw what Crawford had been hiding, the preserved bodies of those who had not survived his twisted purification process. But it was the sound of groaning from one of the cells that caught their attention. A man, weak, emaciated, and covered in the marks of severe abuse, was still alive. Samuel Morrison, Sarah's own husband, had been trapped in the basement for months, just as Billy had described. Billy's testimony had been right. Samuel, though frail and barely conscious, recognized Sarah immediately, and a flood of emotion swept over the group as they realized the extent of the suffering the judge had inflicted on so many innocent men. The sight of the living prisoner was enough to shatter Crawford's final illusion of control. His once great facade collapsed entirely, and he fell to his knees, muttering incoherently about divine justice and the purification of souls. The town had come together to confront the unimaginable, and now they had the proof they needed. Crawford, the man who had held power over them for so long, was no longer their judge. His twisted reign had ended. The authorities were contacted, and the truth of Crawford's crimes spread throughout Millfield like wildfire. The judge was arrested, but the scars of his actions would linger for years to come. The townspeople who had once looked up to him as a pillar of justice were left to grapple with the deep betrayal that had occurred under their very noses. As for Billy Tate, he became a symbol of survival. A reminder that sometimes it is the most unexpected people who have the strength and courage to expose the truth, no matter the cost. And for Sarah Morrison, the fight for justice did not end with Crawford's arrest. She dedicated her life to ensuring that the missing men and those who had suffered at Crawford's hands would never be forgotten. Their stories, once buried beneath the weight of deceit, would be told thanks to the courage of those who refused to remain silent. "Sarah," Reverend Whitmore said gently, his voice filled with compassion, "you must understand that recovery will take time. Samuel's mind has been forever changed by what he's endured. The scars he bears are not just physical, but spiritual. The torment he's experienced has twisted his very understanding of faith. But remember, he is not alone in his suffering. You too must take care of yourself in this process." Sarah nodded, her face a mixture of grief and determination. "I know," she replied, her voice shaky but resolute. "But I can't let go of the hope that one day Samuel will be the man he once was, someone who can lead our community again. Even if it takes years, I will never give up on him." It was a sentiment shared by the other families who had endured similar traumas. The road to healing was long, and many of the survivors of Crawford's basement were haunted by memories they could barely articulate. Dr. Hartwell, who had been working tirelessly to treat the physical wounds of the survivors, had also begun to look at the psychological damage. Some of the men, like Samuel, would likely need years of therapy care and patience before they could even begin to reclaim their sense of self. Yet, as Millfield began to rebuild, a sense of unity grew among the townspeople. The shame of harboring such a monster was heavy, but it was slowly replaced by a collective determination to ensure such horrors would never happen again. The men and women of Millfield, who had been deceived by Crawford's authority for so long, now turned that same strength into rebuilding their community, starting with the survivors. Though there were many tasks ahead, securing proper medical care, assisting the families of the victims, and finding a way to support the psychological recovery of the survivors. Sarah Morrison, Martha Kellerman, and others in the town took it upon themselves to make sure no one was forgotten. They had uncovered the truth, and now they were determined to see that justice would be served for every one of Crawford's victims. As the months passed, Millfield's story began to spread beyond its borders, first to neighboring towns, then to the larger cities of East Texas, and eventually across the state. The courthouse, once a symbol of authority, was now seen as a haunting reminder of the depths of human cruelty. The once gleaming courtroom, where Crawford had presided over his twisted sense of justice, was dismantled, its bricks used in the reconstruction of a new town hall that would stand as a beacon of truth and healing. Sarah and Billy, who had formed a close bond through their shared pursuit of justice, worked together to support the survivors. Billy, once regarded as a vagrant, was now seen as a hero, a man who had risked everything to expose Crawford's depravity. The town, still reeling from the revelations, slowly came to recognize Billy's courage and resourcefulness in helping to save the men who had been trapped in Crawford's underground prison. But for Sarah, her true battle was far from over. While she had fought to uncover the truth and expose Crawford's crimes, she now faced the long, uncertain journey of helping Samuel heal both physically and spiritually. She clung to the belief that one day he would find peace, though she knew it would be a slow and painful process. The legacy of what had transpired in Millfield would not soon be forgotten. The survivors, many of whom had once been forgotten by society, would forever be marked by the horrors they endured. But their voices, once silenced, would now echo throughout Texas, urging others to confront the darkness and speak out against evil, no matter how deeply it may be embedded within the systems they trust. The story of Judge Crawford, his twisted belief in divine justice, his reign of terror in the courthouse basement, became a cautionary tale a reminder of how easily a man in power could justify the most horrifying acts with religious conviction and moral superiority. And in the years that followed, the people of Millfield vowed to rebuild their town, not just physically, but spiritually. They would honor the memory of those lost to Crawford's madness by ensuring that such evil would never again find sanctuary in their community. As time passed, the survivors of Crawford's basement found themselves surrounded by a new kind of strength, the support of their families, the unwavering commitment of their community, and the knowledge that despite the horrors they had endured, they were still alive. And in that life, there was still hope. The story of Judge Crawford's twisted reign of terror in Millfield serves as a dark reminder of how religious authority, when unchecked, can become a vehicle for unspeakable acts. What began as a man's self-conviction of righteousness morphed into a horrifying system of psychological and physical abuse that left deep scars on both the victims and the town. The people of Millfield, once proud of their respected judge, were left grappling with the stark realization that the man they trusted for years had orchestrated a web of suffering under the guise of salvation. For the survivors, the aftermath was an ongoing struggle. Samuel Morrison, Sarah's husband, was a living testament to the psychological toll of Crawford's methods. He was not the man he once was, but a shattered version of the cheerful deacon who had once stood at the front of the congregation. His wife, determined and steadfast, remained by his side, aiding in his recovery with the same relentless spirit that had driven her to expose Crawford's crimes. Though many of the survivors would eventually recover physically, the psychological scars were far more persistent. The trauma of prolonged torture, especially under the guise of divine will, is difficult to overcome. Some, like Billy Tate's cellmate Jacob Mueller, would manage to reintegrate into society, but the emotional toll was something that could never fully heal. Others, especially those who had been held the longest, required permanent care and support from family members or charitable institutions. For Millfield, the psychological impact was profound. The town, once a quaint and isolated community, became a place of haunting memories. Residents, once proud of their roles as law-abiding citizens, were now confronted with the grim reality that they had allowed a monster to walk among them for years. Many of them wrestled with their own guilt. Why had they not questioned the authority that so clearly allowed evil to thrive? This collective guilt, though unspoken, haunted the community for years, even as they tried to rebuild their lives. The courthouse, once a symbol of justice and authority, became a symbol of horror. The building was abandoned, left to decay, as a chilling monument to the crimes that had been perpetrated within its walls. Millfield's citizens couldn't bear to use it again for official purposes, and the courthouse was left to rot, a reminder of the insidious nature of unchecked power. The site eventually became a memorial park dedicated to the victims of Crawford's crimes, though it couldn't wash away the lingering sense of shame and horror that still clung to the town. Reverend Thomas Whitmore, who had played a key role in exposing the horrors of Crawford's actions, spent weeks in Millfield providing spiritual guidance to the survivors and documenting the full scope of the crimes for the Methodist Church. His investigation revealed chilling details about Crawford's background, including fraudulent credentials and a meticulously constructed false identity. Crawford, it turned out, was not even his real name. He had been born Thomas Hartman, a former Confederate intelligence officer with a dark history of prisoner interrogations and torture during the Civil War. Federal investigators soon uncovered that Hartman had assumed the identity of Harrison Crawford, a man with a fabricated background and forged credentials to continue his sadistic practices in a new identity. His careful cultivation of respectability in Millfield, his establishment of a prominent position as the town judge, and his elaborate construction of the basement chambers all pointed to a man who had been planning his crimes long before arriving in the small Texas community. His choice of Millfield was strategic. Its isolation, its people's respect for authority, and its distance from major cities made it the perfect place for him to continue his dark work undetected. Martha Kellerman, whose quiet bravery had been crucial in exposing the truth, became a local hero. Her courage in speaking out and challenging the truth that no one else dared confront led to reforms that would help prevent similar horrors from unfolding in the future. She continued working as a cleaning woman, though her new role as an advocate for prisoners' rights earned her the respect of those who had once looked down on her as just a simple housekeeper. She also became a vocal supporter of prison reforms and efforts to hold authority figures accountable. Billy Tate, once dismissed as simple-minded and a vagrant, found his true calling in the aftermath of the horrors he had witnessed. His bravery and instincts had saved countless lives, and he became a local hero forever remembered for his escape and the pivotal role he played in bringing Crawford's crimes to light. He eventually settled in a neighboring county where he married, started a family, and worked as a carpenter. But he never forgot the horrors he had survived, and he spent his life advocating for prison reform and better treatment of prisoners throughout Texas. Billy's testimony before the state legislature was instrumental in passing new laws that required multiple signatures for prisoner transfers, mandatory reporting of deaths or disappearances, and more stringent background checks for judicial appointments. His efforts brought about sweeping reforms in the Texas judicial system, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The Methodist Church, deeply disturbed by Crawford's abuse of Christian theology to justify his crimes, eventually took action. Whitmore's report, which had been buried for decades, was released to the public in 1967, exactly 100 years after the events unfolded. The report provided crucial insights into how religious authority could be manipulated to justify horrific actions, and it became a key document for historians and criminologists studying the intersection of religious extremism and criminal behavior. Whitmore's findings also led to a broader examination of the dangers posed by religiously motivated crimes in American history, from the Salem witch trials to later cult-related murders. The case of Judge Crawford served as a chilling reminder that true evil often hides behind the mask of respectability and authority. His twisted use of religion to justify torture and murder exposed the vulnerability of even the most trusted institutions. When individuals are allowed to wield unchecked power, Crawford's reign of terror in Millfield was a stark example of how evil can flourish when people fail to ask uncomfortable questions and trust authority blindly. In the end, the survivors of Crawford's basement chambers began to rebuild their lives, but the psychological scars of their ordeal would never fully fade. The town of Millfield, forever marked by the horrors that had unfolded within its boundaries, moved on, though its population dwindled as the stigma of the Crawford case made it a place of dread rather than community. But the legacy of Crawford's crimes lived on in the efforts of those who survived. Efforts to ensure that such horrors would never again go unnoticed, and that the evil that had once taken root in Millfield would be remembered as a warning to future generations. The courage of those like Sarah Morrison, Martha Kellerman, and Billy Tate proved that ordinary people, when faced with unimaginable darkness, can stand together to shine a light on the truth. They had taken on the impossible, defied a judge they once respected, and uncovered a horror that had been hidden beneath their feet for far too long. And though the scars would remain, their actions ensured that the monsters lurking in the shadows would no longer be able to hide. The shadow cast by Judge Crawford's crimes looms large over Millfield and beyond, sparking essential conversations about the nature of authority, accountability, and the rights of vulnerable populations. What initially began as a small community's nightmare soon became a rallying cry for reform, propelling changes in both legal systems and social structures across Texas. The case laid bare the dangers of unchecked power. How one man wielding both judicial and religious authority could manipulate an entire community and perpetuate such unimaginable horrors under the guise of divine justice. This revelation sparked an urgent demand for prison reform, leading to the creation of mandatory inspections of detention facilities, stricter oversight of prisoner transfers, and more comprehensive communication systems between courts and prisons. The reforms extended far beyond Texas, becoming a model for other states grappling with their own systems of institutionalized power. Perhaps the most profound impact of the Crawford case was the increasing recognition of the need for psychological evaluation of judicial appointees and others in positions of authority. Crawford's crimes were enabled by his ability to manipulate not just the law, but also the minds of those around him. His authority was rooted in trust and respect, and it was this trust that allowed him to inflict horrors beyond imagination on his victims for nearly 2 years. Millfield, however, would never be the same. By 1900, the once thriving town had dwindled to fewer than 50 residents. The courthouse, once a symbol of justice, was abandoned, its walls crumbling into ruin. The East Texas climate took its toll on the old building, and it was slowly overtaken by nature, eventually collapsing into the ground, leaving only a few foundation stones as reminders of the town's tragic history. Over time, the place was transformed into a memorial park, a somber space dedicated to remembering the lives lost and the lessons learned. The legacy of the 89 victims of Judge Crawford, however, lives on. The families of those who suffered in the basement chambers of the courthouse kept their memories alive, ensuring that their loved ones were never forgotten. The park features plaques bearing the names of each of Crawford's victims, while educational displays provide visitors with a detailed account of the crimes and the reforms that followed. The annual memorial service held at the site has become a place for survivors' descendants to gather, reflect, and honor the lives lost. Sarah Morrison, whose unyielding determination led to the discovery of the truth, attended every memorial service until her passing in 1943. As the voice of the victims, Sarah reminded each new generation of the importance of questioning authority and protecting the vulnerable. Evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. She would tell the younger generations it comes dressed in respectability, speaking the language of authority and righteousness. Sarah's words became a guiding principle for the town and the many who came to Millfield seeking answers about what had happened. They served as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who believe most fervently in their own righteousness. Judge Crawford had used his position of trust and authority to commit atrocities, cloaking his crimes in the language of divine justice. The long-term psychological effects of Crawford's actions were extensively studied by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell and other medical professionals who examined the survivors. These studies provided valuable insights into trauma recovery and contributed to the growing field of post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) treatment. Dr. Hartwell's notes on Samuel Morrison became key in understanding the psychological manipulation tactics employed by Crawford. Samuel's belief that his suffering had been spiritually beneficial, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, was a clear example of how psychological manipulation can override rational thought. Billy Tate, once considered a simple vagrant, was now regarded as a hero. His remarkable escape and crucial testimony saved the lives of 37 men. Billy, who had been dismissed by many as mentally limited, proved that survival instincts and resilience could triumph over the most sophisticated forms of psychological torture. He settled in a neighboring county, married, and raised a family. But he never forgot his experiences in Crawford's basement. Billy became an advocate for prison reform and better treatment of prisoners throughout Texas, using his testimony to push for laws requiring multiple signatures for prisoner transfers and mandatory reporting of deaths or disappearances. The Crawford case also set significant legal precedents influencing decisions for decades to come. Legal scholars examined the case to highlight the importance of maintaining oversight and accountability in the judicial system. The lack of adequate checks and balances in Crawford's case became a cautionary tale urging reforms to prevent similar abuses of power from occurring in the future. The revelations surrounding Crawford's crimes also sparked theological debates within the Methodist Church and beyond. Church leaders wrestled with how Crawford had twisted Christian teachings to justify his actions, leading to a re-evaluation of how religious authority was regulated. The Methodist Church's decision to introduce new training programs for ministers and implement systems to identify religious extremism was a direct response to the Crawford case. It forced the church to confront the dangers of unchecked authority within religious institutions. Crawford's journals, discovered after his death, revealed the chilling evolution of his criminal methodology. Initially, Crawford had struggled with his desires for control and dominance. But as time passed, he became more comfortable with justifying his actions through a religious lens. His belief that he was an instrument of God's will punishing the sinful grew more entrenched as he used the scripture to rationalize his torture of victims. His writings demonstrated how a man could lose his empathy and humanity, convincing himself that inflicting pain was a divine duty. The lessons learned from the Crawford case became foundational in the study of criminal psychology, particularly in cases involving religiously motivated criminals. Experts like Dr. Michael Harrison noted the similarities between Crawford's methods and those used by cult leaders and authoritarian regimes to manipulate their followers. Crawford's integration of psychological manipulation with physical torture marked a significant development in understanding the psychology of control and coercion. The case continues to be studied and remembered as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths to which individuals can go when they justify their actions with religious or moral righteousness. It highlights the importance of transparency, accountability, and the role that ordinary citizens can play in exposing evil when they encounter it. Crawford's crimes were not just the result of one man's depravity, but the failure of a community to question authority when the signs of corruption were clear. The Crawford case remains one of the most thoroughly documented instances of systematic torture and murder in American history. The town of Millfield, once a thriving community, became a place of reflection where the past's darkest chapter continues to offer invaluable lessons for future generations. Today, as visitors gather to remember the victims and honor the heroes who exposed Crawford's crimes, the Memorial Park stands not just as a site of sorrow, but as a symbol of resilience, vigilance, and the power of ordinary people to confront evil when it hides behind the trappings of authority. If you found this exploration of Millfield's dark history as disturbing and enlightening, as I did, be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, so you never miss another deep dive into America's most shocking historical mysteries. It's important that we continue to study these tragedies to ensure that we never forget the lessons they teach about power, authority, and the need for constant vigilance. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.